Okay, so beginning our discussion of the history of evolutionary biology. So where did we come from and how did we get to here? And someone you're very familiar with is going to feature very prominently in this discussion. So Darwin, Charles Darwin, in 1859 published the book on the origin of species. And when people talk about evolution, almost invariably you're going to hear about Darwin and you're going to hear about the book on the origin of species. And it is wildly influential. But it's important to understand that this work, published in 1859 by Darwin, came out of a whole movement of thought. And we'll talk more about that movement of thought in just a moment. So before Darwin published on the origin of species, there was a lot of interesting, fascinating thought happening. So scientists had already determined at this point, well before Darwin published his book, that the Earth was very, very, very old. So at this point, scientists didn't realize we were into the billions of years, but definitely at this point, the concept in scientific thought was that the Earth was millions of years old. Fossil animals were being discovered, and this was challenging the idea that everything that we see had come into being in exactly the state that it was currently in. So scientists, geologists were digging up fossils, and these fossils were very obviously things that no one had seen before. And the discovery of these fossils led to the idea of extinction. And this may seem something like, duh, we know about extinction. But at this time, in 1817, it was a brand new idea, and it was very strongly challenged, as you might imagine, and kind of still is now today, which is interesting. So the idea of extinction was already well advanced in scientific thought. Oh, and there's a picture. And then a very sort of advanced evolutionary thought of this concept of homology was publicly debated and followed closely by many in the scientific community, this concept of homology. And this concept of homology is something that we're going to talk about again. But if you look at this image that I've shown you here, so the red bone is the same in all of these different animals, human, dog, bird, and whale. Even though these animals are very, very different, they have this same bone. And then same thing with the yellow bone, same thing with the sort of light colored cream bone. And then the 5 fingers, they're fused in the bird, and they look different in the dog, but they're all present. And so this idea of homology was that they have the same bones, so they had to have come from the same source. All of these animals have to be related, and so that was already present in scientific thought well before Darwin published on the origin of species. So the concepts of evolutionary thought were already present before Darwin published on the origin of species. And so what was Darwin's big contribution? His big contribution was natural selection. And in our last lecture, we talked about what natural selection is. And natural selection is kind of at the core of our modern understanding of evolution, this concept of natural selection. So how did he come to natural selection? Well, Darwin was sent to medical school by his father, who was a prominent, wealthy physician. And he wasn't so into medical school, turns out. He didn't really like going to class, and apparently surgery made him ill. And he was much, much more interested in things like marine life, studying marine invertebrates. And he spent a lot of his time with a naturalist group instead of in his medical school studies. And so he ended up dropping out of medical school, and his dad sent him to seminary. So he went to seminary, and he actually did very, very well in seminary. But throughout the course of his seminary studies, he continued to be more interested and more focused on natural life. He had a cousin there who had a butterfly collection, which he was fascinated by, and then this led him to a study of beetles, which beetles are amazing. If you ever have an opportunity to study beetles, do it. So he became, or he didn't become, but he consistently had this focus on the natural world, kind of less than whatever it was he was supposed to be studying. So much so that he developed this very strong reputation as a naturalist. He studied with lots of other prominent naturalists, and back at that time, the seminary was considered to go hand in hand with the study of the natural world. And so in seminary, he had access to a lot of naturalists, and there was a lot of as I pointed out before, emerging thought during this time period, because this was right after the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance is when science started to take the form that we're familiar with science today. And so in the 1800s, there was this explosion of scientific thought, and much of that was happening in seminary. So Darwin was like, to medical school, and like, to seminary, even though he did very well and graduated. And he developed this reputation as a naturalist, so much so that whenever the British were sending out vessels to map the world, they would take a naturalist with them. And Darwin was invited to go on one of these such voyages at the age of 22. So quite young, maybe just a little bit older, a little bit younger than many of you are now. And he got on a boat. You've perhaps heard of it. It's also kind of famous. The HMS Beagle. And so he got to go on this voyage around the world at the age of 22. And when he embarked on this voyage, because of his studies with the naturalists that he had met in seminary, and because of his exposure during medical school to the naturalist groups, sort of the major question he had was, how do species develop? So he was asking sort of one of those major questions about that evolution asks is, how did we get the diversity that we have today? And this was something that was very debated. People didn't know, didn't understand. There were lots of different ideas. And as he was going out on this voyage as a naturalist, he was going to have the opportunity to observe so much natural life. And this was the question that was on his mind. And so this is a map of the voyage that he took over the course of almost 5 years. And so he's starting out, still learning which things show up well and which things don't. So he's starting out here in England, and then we come down. So the little arrows are showing you the trip, which direction they were going. So this is where we started in England, and then came down all along the coast of South America, all back up the coast of South America, and all these stops along the way, he was seeing a lot of things that he hadn't observed before. So a lot of fossils, and he actually got to see some fossils still embedded in the rock. So armadillo fossils, for example, and then living armadillos walking around on the ground just above the fossils. And then he got to see the effects of a very large earthquake and how that shifted the harbor. It actually shifted where the harbor sat in the bay. And so what he was starting to see and starting to really understand is that the earth is very dynamic. It's not fixed, it's changing. And then he came to this place that he's probably the most famous for, the Galapagos Islands. So this little archipelago of islands off the coast of South America is the Galapagos. And when he was on this set of islands, he made some really interesting observations. One of the things that he observed was that the mockingbirds on different islands looked different. So this archipelago, many different islands. And so the mockingbirds on this island, for example, looked different. Oh, that's not the Galapagos, sorry. Looked different than this island, than this island, than this island, for example. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Another thing he observed was the same thing with the marine iguanas. This is a Galapagos marine iguana. Isn't it cool looking? So he observed that on one island, those iguanas looked different than on another island, that looked different than on another island. And that was a really important observation. But what he's most famous for is the finches. You may have even heard them called Darwin's finches, and this is typically how they're referred to. And he was collecting specimens of all these animals as he was going on this journey. And he brought these finches that he's most famous for, I think, or at least I am most familiar with his study of the finches, back to London later. And the ornithologist there in London pointed out to him, hey, these finches are really different. So the finches that you collected at this location are really different than the ones at this location, and are really different than the ones at this location. And we're going to talk about that later in the semester, but that observation was one of the keys to Darwin developing his understanding, his theory of natural selection. And someone else had to point that out to him, which I think is really cool. And it's really important to see that Darwin's discoveries and his thoughts were embedded in all of this other scientific learning and scientific understanding, and so much conversation with other naturalists, and then something like this ornithologist pointing this difference out to him, which he hadn't noticed, which I think is very cool. Okay, so he was here at the Galapagos Islands, and then we go back this way and come out here, back here, and then back up to London. And this was almost 5 years that he spent on this ship, and apparently he was quite seasick the whole time and refused to ever go on another ship again, because this was apparently not the best experience for him. But when he got back to London, he read a work. He read this work, hang on. So Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus had published a book. And Darwin got a hold of this book. And Malthus discussed in this book this concept that food production, so this line right here, is limited and linear. So how much food agriculture can produce is this line I'm coloring over with yellow. So agriculture production is linear, but the population is going to continue to increase, and we've seen that this is true. This is happening. So we have continued increase of the population. And so this concept that you have a limited resource, but a continuously increasing population. And Malthus was focused on humans, on human population and agriculture. This was his interest. But Darwin took this idea, this concept, and realized that this linear line here, that in Malthus's proposal was food, this is in nature, this is any resource. I'll write it up here. So this is, nest sites, right? This is foraging locations. This is anything that any living thing needs is limited. You only have so much of it. And that organisms, just like humans, are going to continue to reproduce. And they're going to reproduce at a level higher than their resources can sustain. And so this would be population or reproduction. And so this concept, taken together with all of these thoughts that he had already been considering, thinking, reading about, led to the concept of natural selection. And so Darwin was writing a sort of fully realized concept of natural selection as early as 1838, and he was writing about this in his notes as early as 1838. He did not publish this. He didn't put it out in the public because he realized the implications of this, the implications of his theory of natural selection, and we still see that today, that people refuse to recognize the truth of natural selection. And back then, it was probably an even stronger resistance. And so he didn't publish this. He went off and did a lot of other cool naturalistic studies. He was super into barnacles for a while. But then someone called Alfred Russel Wallace, who was also a naturalist. He was British, but he was out in Indonesia studying the natural world. And he evidently, in a fever, a delirium induced by malaria, had all these ideas come together for him too. And he knew that Darwin was exploring and thinking about these ideas because while Darwin hadn't published them, he was certainly discussing them with his colleagues, with the other naturalists, other scientists. And so Alfred Russel Wallace sent Darwin a letter about describing natural selection. Natural selection. And at this point, Darwin kind of had to publish. And so they both published their sort of thoughts and writings on natural selection. And the book that became On the Origin of Species was supposed to be an abstract for Darwin's thoughts on natural selection. And so this is what prompted Darwin to finally publish his theory of natural selection. And it was very controversial, and to this day is, for some reason, very controversial. So next we'll discuss, since Darwin, what's come of these theories and how has evolution, quote unquote, evolved.